History does not bury its mistakes. It only hides the bones, and sometimes it seals them in brick, waiting for a moment when the world is finally ready to listen. For 165 years, the ruins of Sombra Verde Plantation, just outside of Thibodaux, Louisiana, kept their silence. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath, suffocated by the humidity, the weight of memory, and the ghosts of the sugar cane. The main house, a grand, rotting skeleton of cypress and brick, finally surrendered its darkest secret not to an archaeologist, but to a structural engineer. In 2024, a preservation team, tasked with stabilizing the last standing chimney, made a discovery that would rewrite the Devereaux family history, transforming it from a tragedy of the Old South into a case file of Gothic horror. Behind a loose block of masonry, tucked deep within the chimney's foundation, they found a small, tin-plated box, miraculously preserved. It was not filled with currency or deeds, but with something far more valuable: two identical leather-bound diaries. They were bound together by a single frayed silk ribbon, a knot that had not been touched since the day it was tied. A genealogist from the state archives was called to the site. With trembling hands, she opened the first volume. The script was pristine, severe, and written with a cold, controlled precision. The final entry, dated October 19, 1859, contained only 3 sentences, a confession that was also a boast. "I have put the monster in the ground. She will not taint our blood. The master is safe." But it was the second diary that held the true key. It was not written by one person but by two identical hands sharing a single terrible story. The genealogist turned back to the first diary, to that final, chilling entry, and realized the truth. This wasn't just a record, it was a murder confession. Before we peel back the layers of this mystery, I need to ask you something. What state or what country are you watching this from? Comment below and let us know where this story is being heard. It's important to know how far the echoes of Sombra Verde have traveled. To understand the diaries, you must first understand the place. Sombra Verde, the green shadow. In 1853, it was not a ruin but a fortress of industry, carved from the Louisiana swamp. It was a kingdom of sugar, built on the twin pillars of human misery and crushing, unbearable order. This kingdom had one ruler, Elara Devereaux. He was not a man of grand passions or southern charm. He was a creature of ledgers, calendars, and the clock. He believed that sentiment was a disease and that chaos was the only sin. His plantation was a testament to this belief. Every bell rang on the second. Every row of cane was perfectly straight. Every life, bought or born, was an asset to be managed, depreciated, or liquidated. The air at Sombra Verde did not move. It was trapped, heavy with the sweet, sickly smell of boiling cane juice and the metallic tang of fear. Elara Devereaux was a man who demanded purity in his crop, in his business, and above all in his bloodline. He was a widower, and his entire world, his entire legacy, was condensed into the 2 lives he controlled as absolutely as any other property on his ledger. His twin daughters, and in his obsessive pursuit of order, Elias had created a pressure cooker. He had cultivated a garden where only monsters could grow. He believed he was protecting his legacy, but he was only ensuring its annihilation. They were Elara and Clara Devereaux, identical in every feature, yet reflections in a fractured mirror. To the rare visitors at Sombra Verde, they were a curiosity, the ebon and ivory twins. Not for their coloring, but for their souls. Elara was the ebon. She was the shadow of her father, pale, severe, and silent. She moved through the great house with a chilling, watchful grace. She loved the master. She did not just respect her father, she worshipped his power. She found beauty in his ledgers, comfort in his rigid schedules, and security in the unshakable certainty of the system he had built. She saw the plantation not as a place of cruelty, but as a model of perfect, natural order. The master at the top, the servants at the bottom. She saw the enslaved not as people, but as components in a grand machine. Her role, as she saw it, was to be the loyal warden, the enforcer of her father's will. She was his eyes, and her gaze was cold and constant. Then there was Clara, the ivory. She too was a shadow, but of a different kind. Clara was drawn not to the great house, but to the margins, To the steam-filled kitchens, the sweltering infirmary, and the distant, haunting spirituals that rose from the quarters after dusk, she loved the slaves. She saw the faces her father and sister refused to. She knew their names. She knew their children. And this empathy in the fortress of Sombra Verde was not a virtue. It was a defect. It was a sickness. For 18 years, these two opposing forces had lived in a delicate, silent truce, bound by the strange, invisible tether of twinship. But in 1853, a new element would be introduced to this volatile equation, and the bond that had held them together would become the very thing that ripped their world apart. The bond between them was more than sisterhood. It was a private language, a shared breath. In a house ruled by an oppressive patriarch who forbade emotional displays, they had become each other's only confidant. They felt each other's moods, a flicker of anxiety in Elara, a wave of sadness from Clara that could cross the house without a word. And they shared a secret that no one, not even their father, knew. The second diary. The one found in the tin box, bound to Elara's private confession. This shared diary was their sanctuary. In its pages they did not write as Elara or Clara. They wrote as we. It was a single, unified consciousness, a secret, composite self. In this book they were not the ebon and ivory twins, they were simply the sister, and in these pages they spoke the truth. We saw father sell the boy Antlin today. He did not cry, but we felt his mother's heart break. Or, the new tutor is afraid of father. We are all afraid of father. For years, this book was their defense, a silent, unified rebellion against the tyranny of their home. But as they blossomed from girls into women, their shared world began to diverge. The single we was beginning to fracture into I, and I, their shared observations became negotiations. Their secrets became burdens. The very book that had been their refuge was becoming a battlefield. And the war would be fought over a man who should have been invisible, a man who represented everything Elara Devereaux sought to control. The arrival of this man was the catalyst. He was the stone dropped into the still, dark water of Sombra Verde, and the ripples would shatter everything. His name was Marcus. He arrived at Sombra Verde not in chains, but in a tailored, albeit worn, suit. He was part of a discreet inheritance, a problem solved by a distant relative in Charleston and passed on to Elara Devereaux. Marcus was literate, a skill his previous master had cultivated for his own business and which Elara found distasteful but useful. He was assigned to the blacksmith's forge, a place of heat, noise, and power. He was tall, with a quiet, unshakable dignity that Elara mistook for docility. The master of Sombra Verde saw him as nothing more than a high-value asset, a tool that could read and write. Elara, her father's shadow, saw him the same way. She noted his efficiency, his strength, and the meticulous way he organized the forge. He was, in her mind, a prime specimen, a valuable piece of the machine. But Clara saw something else. She saw a mind. She saw a man. She began to find reasons to visit the forge, bringing water, requesting repairs for garden tools she had not broken. Their first conversations were clipped, formal, and freighted with mortal danger, but soon they became more. She would ask about the metalwork. He would answer, his words carefully chosen, hinting at a world of knowledge she had never known. For Clara, trapped in her father's oppressive kingdom, Marcus was a window to the outside. For Marcus, enslaved and brilliant, Clara was a dangerous, intoxicating whisper of kindness. They both knew the penalty for these stolen moments, but the connection, once made, was impossible to sever, and they did not know that they were being watched. Elara, from the window of the library, had seen it all. Elara watched. From the house, from the shade of the grand veranda, from the library window that overlooked the forge, she watched, and she documented. She saw Clara's path divert day after day to the blacksmith. She saw the lingering glances. She saw the exchange of water become an excuse for a stolen minute of conversation. At first, Elara felt a cold flicker of annoyance. Clara was being foolish, sentimental, just as their father always warned. She was risking the plantation's order for a moment of idle distraction. But as the weeks turned into a month, Elara's annoyance curdled into something else, something cold and analytical. She began to see Clara's empathy not as a weakness, but as an illness, a contamination, a taint that threatened the sterile purity of Sombra Verde. She watched Clara smuggle a poultice from the infirmary after Marcus burned his arm on the forge. She saw Clara leave a small cake, stolen from the kitchen on the anvil after dark. These were not just acts of kindness. To Elara, they were symptoms of a profound sickness, a betrayal of their blood. She saw Clara as a vector of chaos, inviting the very disorder their father had spent his life fighting to keep at bay. And if Clara was sick, Elara decided, then she would be the physician. She would be the one to diagnose the illness, document its progression, and if necessary, why find the cure? She was no longer just a sister. She was a scientist, and her twin was her first subject. The bond between them was shifting. It was no longer a shield. It was becoming a cage. The rebellion began with a bird. Clara, her heart aching with a mixture of terror and a new, defiant joy, had spent weeks carving a small piece of scrap wood. It was a simple, crude shape, but it was unmistakable, a songbird, wings outstretched in mid-flight. One humid afternoon, under the pretense of retrieving a mended pail, she slipped it into Marcus's hand. It was a symbol of everything they couldn't say. A wish, a prayer, a fantasy of freedom. Marcus's reaction was not what she expected. He closed his hand around the small carving, his face hardening not with gratitude but with a sudden grave intensity. He looked around, his eyes scanning the perimeter, and then looked back at her. He told her in a low, urgent whisper to never come again. The risk was too great, not just for him, but for her. But Clara, emboldened by her own act of defiance, refused. She told him she was not afraid. Seeing that she would not be deterred, Marcus made a fateful and fatal decision. The next day he signaled her. When she approached, he pressed something into her hand, concealed within a piece of rough cloth. It was a book, small, worn, and with its cover torn away. It was a collection of abolitionist essays, a contraband item so dangerous that its discovery would mean his certain death and her absolute ruin. This was no longer a gift of kindness. This was an act of treason. He was not just sharing a secret, he was sharing his soul. And Clara, by accepting it, was no longer just a sympathetic observer. She was a co-conspirator. Elara witnessed the exchange. She was too far away to see what had been passed, but she saw the cloth. She saw the furtive, terrified energy. She saw her sister hide the object in the folds of her skirt and hurry back to the house, her face pale but alive with a secret fire Elara had never seen before. That night, the dynamic of the diaries changed forever. Elara waited for Clara to retrieve their shared journal from its hiding place, but Clara didn't write. She lay in her bed, facing the wall, the small, cloth-wrapped object clutched in her hand beneath her pillow. For the first time, Clara had a secret she would not share. The unified we was broken, so Elara made a decision. She retrieved the other diary from the tin box, the one that was hers alone, the one that would become her confession. She opened the pristine, empty volume, and in her cold, severe script she made her first entry, but she did not write about Clara. Wrote, Subject C. Observation 1. The illness has progressed from sympathetic gestures to active conspiracy. A package was exchanged with the asset M at 1440. The subject is now concealing contraband. She exhibits signs of high agitation, paranoia, and a feverish attachment. The infection is deepening. Containment protocols must be considered. She had transformed her sister into an experiment, her home into a laboratory, and herself into its emotionless, vigilant overseer. The line between protection and pathology had just been erased. Elara was no longer trying to save her sister. She was documenting a monster. The fracture between the twins was solidified by the one man they both sought to please. Elias Devereaux, blind to the simmering betrayals under his own roof, saw only what he wanted to see. One evening at their sparse and silent dinner, he praised Elara. He had reviewed her household ledgers, noting her ruthless efficiency in rationing supplies for the house slaves, cutting costs by a significant margin. "You have a mind for governance, Elara," he said, the closest he ever came to a compliment. "You understand that order is the only virtue. You are a true Devereaux." He then turned his cold gaze on Clara. "You, on the other hand, are soft, Sentimental. I saw you waste thread mending a serving girl's apron. That thread is my property. Your sentiment is a liability. It is a weakness of the blood. He didn't know that Clara had been mending a gash on the girl's arm, hidden by the apron. He just saw the wasted thread. That moment was a coronation for Elara. Her father's words were not just praise, they were a mandate. He had validated her worldview. He had confirmed her superiority. She was the loyal daughter, the strong one, the true heir to his kingdom of order. Clara was the defect, the weakness of the blood. Elara's mission was now clear. It wasn't just to observe. It was to protect the Devereaux line from the sickness her sister carried. Her father's approval had given her purpose. It had justified the coldness in her heart, transforming her jealousy and fear into a righteous, chilling sense of duty. The plantation, her father, and the very concept of master were now her sacred charge, and she would protect them, no matter the cost. The meetings at Forge had to stop. Elara's watchful, silent gaze was a constant presence, but the connection between Clara and Marcus had passed the point of no return. It was no longer about stolen glances, it was about survival. They began to communicate through the one thing that bound them, the contraband book. It was their only channel, a dead drop of paper and ink. Clara would take the book to the woods, to a hollow in an ancient cypress, and underline a single word in a chapter. Wait. She would return the next day and find the book returned, with a new word underlined on a different page, storm. A new language formed between them, a desperate code built from abolitionist text. River, north, boat, freedom. It was a plan pieced together one word at a time. Marcus knew the swamp. He knew the bayous that fed the Mississippi. He knew a man, a free trapper, who sometimes moved cargo north for a price. The coming storm, the first of the hurricane season, would provide the cover they needed. The noise, the chaos, the flooding, it would be their only chance. Their love, born in secret, had now become a conspiracy. They were no longer just a master's daughter and an enslaved man. They were two fugitives planning a crime that the South considered more heinous than murder, the theft of property, the theft of Marcus himself. But as they planned their escape from the prison of Sombra Verde, they were unaware that the prison's most vigilant warden was not their father. It was Clara's own twin. Elara felt the shift. She felt the new, hardened resolve in her sister. She saw the way Clara's eyes now scanned the horizon, watching the clouds, waiting. The sickness was reaching a crisis point. One afternoon, while Clara was in the parlor with their father, enduring a dull lesson in French elocution, Elara saw her chance. She moved with a cold, silent purpose to her sister's room. She did not ransack it. She observed it. She was a detective looking for the nest where the disease was breeding. She ran her hands along the bed frame, tapped the floorboards, checked the armoire. And then she found it. Beneath the mattress, tucked between the ropes and the thin horsehair padding, was the cloth-wrapped object. She pulled it out. Her hands were perfectly steady. She unwrapped the rough fabric and her breath caught not in a gasp but in a cold, sharp intake of vindication. It was a book, not just any book. She recognized the publisher's mark from Boston. She opened it and the words leaped off the page, words like tyranny, liberation, and the inhumanity of bondage. She saw the underlining. She saw the words north, river, wait, storm. She did not understand the exact code, not yet, but she understood the intent. This was not the sentimental poetry of a lovesick girl. This was a map. This was a plot. This was high treason against her father, her home, and her entire world. A cold, terrible certainty settled over her. She had been right. The sickness was terminal. She carefully wrapped the book and placed it back exactly as she had found it. She would not confront Clara, no. A surgeon does not reason with a tumor. She isolates it and then she cuts it out. The instrument of this surgery arrived at Sombra Verde 3 days later, splattered in mud and radiating a coarse, violent energy. The previous overseer, a man who had grown complacent, was dismissed by Elias Devereaux for a minor discrepancy in the sugar yields. His replacement was a man named Finn. Finn was not a creature of cold ledgers like Elias. He was a man of the whip, of loud, sudden rages. He was poor white from the piney woods of Mississippi, and he carried a deep, venomous resentment for the very planter aristocracy he now served. He established his authority on his first day by publicly whipping a field hand for not running fast enough when the bell rang. He was, in short, a brute, and he was deeply insecure. When he was introduced to the twin daughters of the master, he was visibly awed. He bowed awkwardly, his eyes wide. He looked at Elara with a kind of fearful respect. But when his gaze fell on Clara, his expression shifted. He saw her averted eyes, her gentle demeanor, her sentimental softness, and he mistook it for weakness. He gave her a leering, possessive smile. It was a look that disgusted Clara, but Elara, watching from the doorway, felt a sudden dark clarity. This man, Finn, he was perfect. He was crude, jealous, and predictable. He was a rabid dog on a chain, loyal only to the master who fed him. And Elara realized, in that cold, calculating part of her mind, that all she had to do was point him in the right direction. The manipulation was a masterpiece of subtlety. Elara did not make accusations. She simply planted seeds. 2 days later, she accidentally encountered Mr. Finn on the veranda just as he was reporting to her father. As Elia stepped inside his study for a moment, Elara let out a small, troubled sigh. Finn, eager to ingratiate himself with the master's favored daughter, immediately asked if something was wrong. "Oh, it is nothing, Mr. Finn," Elara said, her voice a perfect blend of sisterly concern and patrician weariness. "It is just my sister." She paused as if reluctant to speak. "She has a strange fascination with the forge." She let the words hang in the humid air. Finn's eyes narrowed. "A fascination, Miss Elara?" "Yes," Elara continued, looking away as if embarrassed. "With the blacksmith, Marcus. My father calls her sentimental. She doesn't understand the dangers. She wastes her time there. She believes they can be friends." Elara had just done 3 perfect, terrible things. She had directed Finn's suspicious gaze squarely at Marcus. She had intimately linked him with Clara, planting a seed of crude, possessive jealousy. And she had established that Clara was a naive, foolish girl who was being influenced. Finn's mind, simple and brutal, leaped to the only conclusion it could. The slave was manipulating the master's daughter. He was getting above his station. He was a threat that needed to be neutralized. Elara watched the man's knuckles turn white as he gripped the railing. She had aimed the weapon. Now, she just needed to wait for the right moment to pull the trigger. It is so easy to see Elara as a monster, a sociopath in a silk dress. But in the cold recesses of her own mind, preserved in the ink of her private diary, she was the hero. She was the protector. What do you think? Was Elara truly born evil, or was she just a twisted, loyal product of the monstrous system she was trying to protect? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. In her worldview, the system of Sombra Verde was the body politic. It was order. It was life. And Clara was an infection that, if allowed to fester, would kill the entire body. She believed Clara's foolish, sentimental actions would not lead to freedom. They would lead to annihilation. She envisioned the future. Clara caught, Marcus hung. Her father, his bloodline and honor shattered, turning his rage on everyone. She saw the plantation burning, not from a slave revolt, but from the inside out, consumed by her sister's sickness. In Elara's mind, her plan was not murder. It was quarantine. It was a necessary, terrible surgery to save the family, the legacy, and the order of her world. By stopping Clara, she believed she was saving everyone, including, in a twisted way, Clara herself, saving her from a fate worse than death. But as Elara rationalized the cold-bloodedness of her plan, she was blind to a new, biological reality. The sickness she was so determined to cure was about to take on a physical form she could never have anticipated, a truth that would make her desperate, surgical strike an absolute necessity. The confession, when it came, was not spoken. It was written. The storm that Marcus was waiting for was still a whisper on the horizon when Clara, her hands trembling, retrieved the shared diary. She could no longer carry the secret alone. She needed her sister. She needed the other half of we. She opened the book, and with a pen that shook so badly it spattered the page, she wrote, "Elara, I must speak plainly. I can hide it no longer. I am with child. It is his. Father will kill us both when he knows. He will kill him. I beg of you, by the bond we share, by the mother we lost, help us. Help me." She slid the open book across the table to where Elara sat, mending a lace collar. Elara put down her needle. She read the entry. Clara watched her, her heart hammering, expecting an explosion. She expected rage, disgust, tears. She saw nothing. Elara's face became a perfect porcelain mask. She looked up from the page, her gaze flat and empty. "I see," she said. She closed the book. For Clara, the confession was a desperate plea for help. For Elara, it was the final, irrefutable diagnosis. The sickness was no longer just an idea. It was not just a forbidden book or a carved bird. The taint was now flesh. It was a physical contamination of the Devereaux bloodline growing in her own sister's womb. That night, Elara's private diary entry was short and cold. "The infection has metastasized. It has created a host. The surgery must be immediate." The sickness now had a heartbeat, and Elara knew she had to be the one to stop it. Elara's response when it came the next morning was shocking. She found Clara weeping in her room and embraced her. "You are my sister," she whispered, her voice a perfect imitation of kindness. "You are my blood. I will not let our father destroy you." Clara collapsed in her arms, sobbing with a gratitude so profound it was painful. She had her sister back. The we was whole again. "The storm is 2 days out," Elara said, her tone now brisk and conspiratorial. "That is when you must go. I will secure us passage. I will find the money." But Elara had no intention of finding money. That night, while the Ooze slept and the first winds began to lash the trees, she slipped into her father's study. She did not go to his desk where he kept the household cash. She went to the wall safe, hidden behind a portrait of her grandfather. She entered the combination. The heavy door clicked open. She bypassed the stacks of currency, the deeds, the plantation bonds. She reached for a single black velvet box. Inside, resting on faded satin, was her mother's diamond necklace. It was a cascade of heavy, brilliant stones, a treasure from their family's past in France. It was Elias Devereaux's most prized possession, the one object he valued with something approaching sentiment. It was irreplaceable, and Elara took it, not as a tool for escape, but as the final, perfect, irrefutable piece of her trap. She presented the necklace to Clara in the gray light of dawn. "This will buy your freedom," Elara said, the diamonds glittering coldly in her hand. "This will buy passage for you both far to the north, far away from here where you will be safe." Clara was horrified. "Elara, this is father's, this is mother's. He will know it's gone. He will think it was stolen by a house servant," Elara said, her voice firm. "By the time he discovers it, you will be gone. It is our mother's. She would have wanted you to be free. Now go, give this to him, tell him to hide it and to wait for the storm." Clara, blinded by hope, blinded by her sister's sudden, fierce loyalty, believed the lie. She believed in this act of profound sacrifice. She ran to the forge for one last, desperate meeting, the heavy necklace concealed in her pocket. She pressed it into Marcus's hand. He recoiled. He knew instantly what it was. He knew its value and he knew its danger. This was not a tool, it was a death sentence. "I cannot take this," he whispered, trying to push it back. "It is our only way," Clara insisted, her eyes wild with fear and hope. "Elara gave it to us. She is helping us." Marcus, trusting the woman he loved, finally, fatefully relented. Later that night, he hid the necklace in the one place that was his alone. He tucked it deep into the straw ticking of his small, thin cot, alongside the worn, contraband abolitionist book. He had just unknowingly armed his own executioner with 2 forms of perfect, damning evidence. The storm was no longer a whisper. It was a gathering scream. The sky had turned a bruised, yellowish purple, and the air was so thick it was hard to breathe. Inside the great house, Elara sat at her writing desk. She did not use her fine, monogrammed stationery. She used a rough piece of scrap paper from the kitchen, the kind used for wrapping bacon. She did not use her silver-nibbed pen. She used a broken, rusted nib she had found in the stables and dipped it in cheap, black laundry ink. She did not write in her elegant, severe script. She wrote in crude, blocky, barely literate letters, pressing so hard the nib tore the paper, her hand disguised by a purposeful lack of skill. The note was simple. "Mr. Finn." She knew he would be the first to read it. "The blacksmith stole the old mistress's diamonds. He bewitched the girl Clara. He has them in his cot. He has the book they planned to run in the storm." She had given him everything: the thief, the victim, the motive, the proof, the location, and the precise timing. She folded the note. Long after the house was silent, as the first drops of rain began to fatly strike the windows, she slipped out of her room barefoot. She moved down the servant's staircase, a ghost in her own home, and slid the note under the overseer's door. Her hand did not tremble. As she walked back to her room, the first crack of thunder split the sky. The trap was set. Finn found the note at 4 in the morning. His rage was immediate and explosive. It was not the righteous anger of a man avenging a theft. It was the white-hot personal fury of a man who had been played for a fool, the slave, the blacksmith. He had bewitched the master's daughter, the one Finn himself had coveted. It was a personal, humiliating affront. He didn't wait for Elias. He didn't wait for dawn. He grabbed a lantern and his shotgun, deputized 2 other field hands, and plunged into the driving rain. The storm was now a primal force, the wind howling like a living thing. He kicked open the door to Marcus's small, dark cabin. Marcus, startled from sleep, was dragged from his cot and thrown against the wall. "Where is it, boy?" Finn screamed, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "Where are her diamonds?" Marcus, confused and terrified, said nothing. Finn didn't need a confession. He ripped the straw mattress apart with his bare hands. The diamonds spilled out, glittering cold and wet in the manic light of the lantern, and beside them, soaked but intact, was the book. Finn snatched it up. He saw the title. He saw the underlined words. He held up the necklace in one hand and the book in the other. It was the perfect diabolical picture: theft, abolitionism, and the seduction of a white woman. "Get the master," Finn roared, shoving the muzzle of the shotgun against Marcus's head. "Get him now. We got the devil." Marcus was dragged through the mud, half naked in the driving rain, and thrown onto the floor of the main library. Elara Devereaux was roused from his bed, his face a mask of confusion and cold anger. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice thin with sleep and rage. "He stole it, master," Finn spat, throwing the wet, muddy diamond necklace onto the polished floor. It landed with a dull, heavy clink. "Stole the mistress's diamonds, and this." He then threw down the abolitionist book, its pages splayed open. "He's been poisoning Miss Clara's mind with this abolitionist filth." Elara Devereaux looked from the necklace to the book. His mind, so rigid and orderly, could not process the scene. He saw the 2 most impossible, contradictory items side by side, a thief and a political revolutionary. It made no sense. "He did not steal it." A scream cut through the room. Clara, her hair wild, having heard the commotion, burst in. "He did not steal it. I gave it to him." The silence that followed was more violent than the storm. The wind, the rain, the thunder, all of it seemed to recede, sucked into the vacuum of that one shattering admission. Elara Devereaux turned, his movement slow and reptilian, to face his daughter. He saw her. He truly saw her for the first time, the wildness in her eyes, the defiant, protective stance. And then his gaze dropped, and in the shifting lantern light, he saw the subtle, unmistakable swell of her abdomen beneath her nightgown. The sickness was no longer a secret. It was a visible physical reality standing in his library. He did not scream. He simply walked to Clara and with a cold, precise movement slapped her across the face. She fell, a small, broken sound escaping her. He could not acknowledge her complicity. To do so would be to admit his own blood was tainted, his own house was septic. It was easier, cleaner, to believe the lie. "He bewitched her," Elias whispered, his voice empty of all emotion. "He corrupted her." The trial was over. Elara Devereaux's mind, faced with an unendurable reality, had snapped back to its default state, absolute cold order. The problem would be liquidated. "Mr. Finn," Elias said, his voice now terrifyingly calm, "take him to the old rice mill, lock him in. He will be made an example of at dawn." He then turned to Clara, who was still on the floor, clutching her face. "You," he said, as if to a stranger, "you will be confined to your room. Mr. Finn, you will lock her door from the outside. She will see what happens when the natural order is defied." Clara was dragged, screaming and sobbing, from the room. "Elara!" she shrieked, looking for the sister who had promised to help her. "Elara, please!" But Elara was not there. She was standing in the shadows of the upper hallway, watching the entire scene unfold. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. She watched Clara get dragged away. She watched Marcus, his face a mask of blood and rain, get hauled out into the storm. In her mind, the surgery was proceeding. The diseased parts were being isolated. The tumor was being excised. The body of Sombra Verde, though racked with pain, would be saved. She had contained the sickness. She had protected her father. She had saved the Devereaux line. As she turned to go to her room, she saw her own reflection in a dark window. Her face was calm, her expression placid. She looked, she thought, like her father's daughter. She looked, she thought, like a true Devereaux. The storm passed just before dawn, leaving the world scoured, wet, and unnaturally silent. The air was cool, the sky a bruised, exhausted purple. They did not use the normal hanging tree in the quarters. Elias, in his cold, calculated shame, ordered it done at the edge of the property, by the great oak that bordered the swamp, as far from the house as possible, but not so far that it couldn't be seen. If this story is gripping you, if you feel the horror and the injustice of this moment, please subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America. We tell the stories that history has tried to forget, and we cannot do it without your support. Marcus was led to the tree. His hands were bound. His face was swollen and cut, but his dignity had returned. He did not beg. He did not plead. As Finn, enjoying his role, threw the rough rope over the thickest branch, Marcus's eyes scanned the distant main house. He was looking for one thing, and then he saw it. In the attic window, the one room Elias had deemed secure enough, a window had been shattered. Clara was there. She had smashed the glass with her own bare hands. She was screaming his name, a sound that was lost in the vast, wet distance. Marcus, Marcus, he saw her. He locked his eyes on her window, and he did not look away. Get on why? "Th it," Elias Devereaux commanded, his voice dead. Finn kicked the small stool out from under him. The sound that followed was a small, final, sickening snap, and in the attic window, Clara's screams dissolved into a long, low, animal wail of grief, before she, too, fell silent. The silence that fell over Sombra Verde after the execution was not peace. It was a toxic, suffocating void. The machine of the plantation, which had run on Elias Devereaux's perfect, brutal order, was broken. The master had shattered his own law. He had executed a man for a crime his own daughter had confessed to, a lie everyone on the plantation, enslaved and free, knew to be false. The master's purity was a sham. His order was a brutal farce. Elias locked himself in his study, not with his ledgers but with a crate of brandy. He did not emerge. The bells that governed the day fell silent. The work crews, left without direction, moved with a new, sullen, dangerous inertia. Finn, puffed with the power of his new position as the master's enforcer, roamed the grounds, but even he could sense that the fundamental equations of power had been irrevocably broken. Elara, the supposed victor, found herself in a kingdom of ash. She was the mistress of a house that no longer functioned. The house slaves who had once feared her now looked at her with something else in their eyes, a cold, knowing contempt. She had not saved her father, she had destroyed him. Her surgery had not saved the patient. It had killed him, leaving only a hollow shell, and in the attic the source of the sickness remained. Clara was now a ghost, a catatonic prisoner in her own home, refusing food, refusing to speak, her gaze fixed on the broken window and the distant, terrible tree. The taint was still growing in the silence, and Elara, for all her cold precision, had no idea what to do next. The break in routine, the sudden, violent rupture of the plantation's order, had a practical and deadly consequence. The fever which had always lingered in the swampy margins of Sombra Verde saw its chance. With the overseer's attention elsewhere and the master submerged in alcohol, the basic protocols of sanitation, the lye washing, the mosquito netting repairs, the draining of standing water, were ignored. Dysentery, the bloody flux, moved from the quarters to the main house with terrifying speed. It was a convenient, natural cover for the unnatural decay that had already taken root. A field hand died, then a child, then one of the kitchen staff. The fever provided a grim, plausible excuse for the sudden dark pall that had fallen over the plantation. But the fever was not just a cover. It was a reckoning. Elias Devereaux, his body weakened by days of sustained, furious drinking and his soul hollowed out by shame, was an easy target. He was found collapsed in his study by Elara, his body burning, his mind delirious. For 3 days he raved, not about ledgers or sugar yields, but about tainted blood and snakes in the house. On the 4th day he grew quiet. Elara sat by his bed, wiping his forehead, the perfect, dutiful daughter. He opened his eyes, his gaze clearing for one final, lucid moment. He looked at her, his lips pulling back in a grimace of pure hatred. "You," he hissed. "Cursed girl." Then he died, his eyes wide open, his final curse hanging in the air. But which daughter had he meant? Clara, who had betrayed his bloodline, or Elara, who had brought the entire temple crashing down? The Civil War was now a raging inferno, its flames licking at the edges of Louisiana, but at Sombra, Verde, the war was already over. Elara Devereaux was in the ground, buried next to the mother his daughters barely remembered. The plantation technically belonged to both twins, but in reality there was only one mistress, Elara. With her father gone, she assumed total control. The mask of the dutiful daughter fell away, revealing the cold, absolute monarch beneath. She was the master now. Her rule was not like her father's, built on rigid, predictable order. It was a rule of oppressive, erratic silence and cold, watchful terror. The enslaved, already weakened by the fever and shattered by the recent horrors, whispered that the cold twin was worse than the old master. He had been a tyrant, but she was a phantom. She seemed to be everywhere, her gaze constant. Her sister, Clara, was her only living relative and her first prisoner. She was moved from the attic to a comfortable bedroom, but the door remained locked. She was the living, breathing evidence of Elara's victory, and the final, festering piece of the sickness she had yet to cure. Clara, visibly pregnant, was now a specter, her mind lost in a fog of grief, her body just a vessel for the one thing Elara could not control, the taint that was still to come. The baby was born on the 19th of October, 1859, on a night so still and quiet it felt like the world was holding its breath. The storm that had raged during Marcus's death was now an echo, replaced by a suffocating, windless silence. Only one person was permitted to attend the birth, an old, terrified house slave named Mamie, who had served as the plantation's midwife for 30 years. Elara had locked the door behind them. The labor was long and agonizing, Clara's body weakened by starvation and grief. But as dawn approached, the child was born. It was a boy. He was small but healthy, and he let out a strong, defiant cry. Mamie, following the instincts of her trade, cleaned the infant and wrapped him in a linen sheet. She tried to hand him to Clara, but Clara just stared, her eyes empty, seeing not her child but the ghost of the man who had died for him. Mamie, her hands trembling, then offered the child to Elara. Elara looked at the newborn. She studied his face in the lamplight. She saw Marcus's high cheekbones, his strong jaw, and his dark, defiant eyes. She saw the infection made flesh. The taint was no longer a theory or a secret or a swelling in her sister's belly. It was here. It was breathing the air of her house. It had a face. "He needs to be cleaned properly," Elara said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Go, boil fresh water and bring new linens. Leave us." Mamie, terrified but obedient, curtsied and slipped out of the room, her relief at escaping the oppressive silence palpable. Elara locked the door behind her. She was now alone, just the three of them. The true Devereaux, the sick Devereaux, and the taint itself. Clara had fallen into a state of exhausted, waking delirium, muttering Marcus's name. Elara went to her own medical cabinet, a small box where she kept the household remedies. She poured a heavy, dark liquid into a glass, a dose of laudanum so profound it was not medicinal, it was final. "Drink this," she said, lifting Clara's head. "It is for the pain, it will let you sleep." Clara, in her broken state, obeyed without question. She drank the sweetened opium, her gaze still fixed on something far beyond the walls of the room. In her private diary, Elara would later write, "The host was too weak to be saved. The sickness had consumed her entirely. A humane solution was required for both." She watched as Clara's breathing slowed, her eyes fluttering shut, a final, peaceful sigh escaping her. The host was now neutralized. Elara then turned her attention to the infant, who was beginning to stir in his linen wrapping. The infant's cry was small, but to Elara it was a scream. It was the sound of her father's failure, her sister's betrayal, and the contamination of her entire line. It was the sound of chaos. It was the sound that proved the master had failed, and she, the new master, would not. She walked to the bed, her movements unhurried, her face calm. The baby looked up, its new eyes struggling to focus. Elara felt no hatred. She felt no anger. She felt, as she wrote later, only the quiet, cold necessity of the cure. She picked up a heavy, goose-down pillow from the nearby chair. She did not hesitate. She did not weep. She placed it over the infant's face and pressed down with all her weight. The tiny body struggled for a few frantic seconds. The muffled, desperate sounds were quickly extinguished. She held it there for a full minute until the last, faint tremor had ceased. Then she removed the pillow. The room was perfectly silent. The taint was gone. The sickness was cured. The Devereaux bloodline was at last pure. Clara was now breathing in shallow, rattling gasps, the laudanum pulling her into a sleep from which she would never wake. The surgery was complete. When Mamie returned with the hot water, Elara met her at the door. Her face was a mask of perfect, tragic grief. "My sister," Elara whispered, her voice breaking. "She was too weak, she and the child. They did not survive the birth." Mamie's eyes widened in horror, but she said nothing. What could she say? Elara was the law. "They must not be buried in the slave cemetery," Elara commanded. "And they cannot be put in the family plot. It would be a disgrace. My father is building a new library. The chimney foundation is still open. It is a consecrated place in its own way. It will be their tomb. It will keep them safe. It will keep them secret." That night, Elara and the terrified, weeping Mamie did the work themselves. They wrapped Clara's body in her finest silk dress. They wrapped the infant in a simple linen sheet. In the dead of night, they carried the two small, still burdens to the new, unfinished library. The chimney's foundation was a raw, open wound in the floor, a space of brick and wet mortar. They lowered the bodies in. First Clara and then her tiny, unnamed son placed in her arms as if in a final, loving embrace. "You will never speak of this, Mamie," Elara said, her voice like steel. "You saw nothing. They died of the fever." Elara then took a trowel and began to lay the first row of bricks herself, sealing the tomb brick by agonizing brick. She returned to her room as the first pale gray light of dawn touched the windows. Her hands were raw, the skin scraped and burned from the lye in the mortar. She walked to the wash basin and poured the water. It turned a milky gray as she scrubbed her hands, watching the residue of the tomb, the dust of her sister and nephew's final resting place, circle the drain. She was not grieving. She was not horrified. She was, for the first time in her life, perfectly at peace. The house was finally, truly silent. The chaos was gone. The sickness was purged. She sat at her desk, her hands still damp, and opened her private diary, the one that was hers alone. She dipped her pen in the ink, and in her cold, precise, and perfectly steady hand, she wrote the final entry. October 19, 1859. "I have put the monster in the ground. She will not taint our blood. The master is safe." She closed the book. She then retrieved the other diary, the shared one, the one that held Clara's final, desperate plea. She looked at it for a moment, a relic of a bond that was now nothing but ash. She took the silk ribbon, the one that had bound them as twins, and tied the two diaries together, her confession and her sister's truth. She placed them in the small tin box and she sealed it. Later that day, she would have a bricklayer brought in from town finish the chimney in the library. But before he arrived, she placed the box deep inside the structure, on a ledge just above the foundation, sealing her justification for the crime, right alongside the crime itself. We are back in 2024. The genealogist is standing by the excavated chimney, the two diaries in her gloved hands. The sun is setting over the ruins of Sombra, Verde, casting long, green shadows across the property. She has just finished reading Elara's final, chilling entry. The entire horrific narrative is complete. An archaeologist from the preservation team approaches, his face grim. He's holding a tablet. "You were right to stop our work," he says, his voice low. Forensics just confirmed the preliminary findings from the site. The skeletal remains in the foundation, they're co-mingled. An adult female, Caucasian, late teens, and a neonate, an infant, buried at the same time. The female's skull shows trauma consistent with a fall, but the laudanum overdose, that's what Elara's diary clarifies. The infant, the hyoid bone is, well, it's consistent with asphyxiation. The genealogist looks from the archaeologist to the dark, gaping wound of the chimney. The monster was Clara. The taint was her newborn child. Elara's cold, analytical documentation, her story of Subject C, was not a metaphor for a moral failing. It was the detached, sociopathic case file of a premeditated double homicide. The tin box was Elara's final, arrogant justification, a confession hidden with her victims, a message to a future she was certain would understand and vindicate her terrible, necessary surgery. What became of Elara Devereaux, the last master of Sombra Verde? The historical record is brief but bitterly ironic. The master she killed for, the system of power and purity she murdered her own blood to protect, was annihilated. When the Civil War ended, Sombra Verde, already crippled by debt and decay, was lost. The plantation was seized by the Union Army and later sold off in parcels during Reconstruction. The Devereaux line, which Elara had so brutally purified, was left with nothing. She fled to New Orleans, a penniless refugee of a world she had helped to destroy. She did not die a grand, tragic figure. She died in 1881, a bitter, childless, and forgotten recluse in a single, rented room in the French Quarter, haunted by the very ghost she herself had created. The grand legacy she had murdered her sister and nephew to protect ended with her, in poverty and obscurity. So we are left with the final, terrible question. Who was the true monster of Sombra Verde? Was it the brutal patriarch Elias who built the prison? Was it Clara, the sinner, who dared to defy its laws with an act of forbidden love? Or was it Elara, the surgeon, who, in her fanatical devotion to a system of unnatural order, became the most profound, cold-blooded, and inhuman monster of all? Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of America's darkest, hidden stories. What do you think? Leave your theories in the comments below. And if you believe these forgotten histories need to be told, subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America. We'll see you in the shadows.